Hi, welcome to Refuge Church. If this is your first time with us, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. We encourage you to check out the intro video that hopefully is playing on the same page so you can get a little bit of a sense of who we are. But if you are new, perfect timing. We're starting our series on Exodus. I'm so excited to jump into it with you. Exodus is a phenomenally relevant current book. It's been used historically in the liberation theology movement in South America, in the abolitionist and civil rights movements in the States. And so it is full of treasures and ideals and foundations of justice that are so important and so critical for us to be studying at this time. Last thing, if you hear strange noises coming from somewhere over there, I have a 2-month-old hanging out with my husband in the other room. So it's not a wild animal, it's just my son. All right, let's pray. God, I thank you so much for this technology that we get to come together even virtually and look at your text and see what you have for us to discover in it. I ask that whatever it is that you would like to impart to these people that you have brought, that our ears would be open to hear that our hearts would be open to be able to receive what it is that you have for us today. Please bless my words to be clear and understandable and life-giving. I ask all these things in the name of your Son. Amen. Okay. So the book of Exodus, in Hebrew, it's called Shemot. Each of the first 5 books of the Bible, which are called the Torah, are named after the first major word in the sentence. So Genesis is named Bereshit, which means in the first, or in the head, or in the beginning. Exodus is called Shemot, which means names, which if you look at verse 1, if you have a Bible with you, you'll see it there. These are the names. Leviticus is called Vayikra, which means, and he called. Numbers is desert, Midbar, and Deuteronomy is Devarim, which can be translated things or words. So here we are in Shemot, and it kicks off, like I said, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. And it reviews this for us because in the previous book, Joseph or Jojo, depending on how you feel, has made his way up from slave to prison and then up through the government hierarchy of the country or the civilization of Egypt. And he was able to save the country and his family from famine. And so all of his family came over to Egypt with him or after him to be saved, and they created an immigrant community in the Nile Delta called Goshen, up in the north of this civilization. And so when Shemot opens, it's catching us up on what has happened, and it relists for us all the names of the members of Joseph's family, and that's how the curtain opens. So let's jump in at verse 6. I'm using the Complete Standard Bible today because it's clear and straightforward. However, we'll talk a lot about differences in translation. There are other translations that I recommend that are more literal, but for ease, I like to put out a PDF every week that has the discussion and reflection questions that we like to use, but often it also has the different Hebrew words, and sometimes, like this week, it has the translation of the text that we're looking at in it. So feel free to go refer to that PDF. Hopefully the link got out to you as well from whoever referred you to the sermon. Feel free to enjoy. Okay, so verse 6, it says, Joseph, and all his brothers and all that generation eventually died. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. So here we have this, there's a setup, spoiler alert, a lot of oppression is about to unfold right after this. So this is setting the stage. How does oppression get started? How do these systems of injustice get formed? The Bible, cool enough, tells us how that happens in these few verses. So first thing, Joseph and his brothers died, but in verse 7, we have 5 separate verbs that describe what happened to the Israelites when they were there. What were they doing? And it says they're flourishing, they're growing, their numbers were growing, they became great. It literally says they became mighty, very, very in the Hebrew. But specifically, there's more little keys hidden in that text, which is what's so great about these old 1,000-year-old sections in our Bible, is they have so many little details in the nooks and crannies. So we have the word paru and vayoravu and timele. And each of those words, which is they became fruitful and they became great and they filled the earth. Those you might recognize are from Genesis 1. When God made humanity, he told them to be fruitful. As most of us remember it, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So here we see, just like he told them to, and just like God promised their great-great-great-grandfather, Abraham, they're doing those things wherever they are. That's beautiful. That's great. So that's verb 1, 3, and 5. And if you're familiar with a chiasm, which is an ancient literary structure from the Near East, which focuses on parallelisms, and then at the central point is what you're supposed to focus on, kind of the locus of gravity, the treasure hidden at the middle. So they became great is the treasure that's hidden at the middle of this one. But 1, 3, and 5 are from Genesis 1. So where are 2 and 4 from that are mirroring one another? They align with each other in the parallelism. The first one comes from Genesis 26, is the last and only other previous time we see it. And it is what the Hebrew people are called by the villain or antagonist of that story, Avimelech. Avimelech, or Abimelech, you might have heard. Avimelech is having a dispute with Yitzhak, or Isaac, over resources. According to Avimelech, there is not enough for both Yitzhak's people, who he says are too powerful, which is what we have here, that they have become powerful, that they're too powerful, there's too many of them, and there's not enough water for both of them to share. So this is our first foundation layer of how oppression comes. If we have the mindset of scarcity, a mindset of not enough room for both of us in this area, that lays the groundwork for further violence to come. It's the very, very first step that we can see put here. So the narrator slips it in the text to remind us, a little foreshadowing of, last time what Yitzhak had to do was he had to leave. And so it's foreshadowing for what's going to happen eventually. Of course, more spoilers in this story. So that's this verb. What about this one? What's the other one that hasn't been used before in Genesis 1? It's the word sharatz, and it is from the creation story, and it's when God makes the animals that swarm. So to be more literal, it would say that they became great and they swarmed. So it's this image of the insects, of the creeping, crawling things on the ground. So the second step that happens when oppression is on its way, when systems of injustice are being put in place, is dehumanizing language. When we stop seeing the other as us, but rather an other, it becomes easier to dehumanize them, easier to see them less than human, as deserving less dignity, less respect, less resources. That sets the stage. And then the third step, so those were 5 verbs. The last step is in verse 8, and it says, the new king who did not know about Joseph came into power. And so the last thing that we need when setting up these systems of injustice is when we are not talking, we are not in dialogue, we're not in relationship with the people who are the other, or who we have made the other. He didn't know Joseph anymore. He didn't know this immigrant community. He didn't have connections that Joseph used to be the Grand Vizier in politics in Egypt. And so the question for us It's so easy for us, which is completely valid, to look at our nation's history and all the people that we have marginalized and oppressed and shoved to the side, and look at what points we started calling those people dirty, or we started calling those people thugs, we started calling those people dangerous, other, not us. There's not enough resources for us here. We have to try to recreate a 1950s America that we imagine to have existed, which in fact didn't particularly, but whatever. But it's our job to also turn that eye upon ourselves and say, when we think of those people, whoever those people might be for you, might be members of the opposing political party, it might be other Christians, anyone who qualifies as those people, people who follow the pandemic differently than you do. It is so easy for us to fall into those same patterns, dehumanizing, having a worldview of not enough, not seeking out relationship with those people. So how can we cultivate a worldview of I do have enough, a worldview of abundance, a worldview of there is enough space for both of us, so that we don't perpetuate those same patterns? Really important, really important. Don't let yourself off the hook. Okay, so what does this new king do? He set the stage for this oppression to be unveiled. He calls all the people together and he has a plan. Verse 9. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So his strategy here is pretty familiar. He doesn't say those immigrants in your neighborhood or in the neighborhood one over are just going to suddenly stab you in the market one day. He doesn't start there. He says, look, your neighbors over there, they're different than us, and they're getting stronger. So they kind of represent a reasonable threat. And yeah, they're not going to suddenly stab you. But what if we get invaded by another country, by another people group? And what if they look at them and say, you know what, their life is a little better than ours, or their way of doing things is better. And then they join them, and at that point they start attacking us, right? Evil likes to dress itself as a reasonable strategy, a wise strategy, which is the thing. My translation here says deal shrewdly with them. It doesn't say deal shrewdly in the Hebrew, it says wisely, right? Evil hardly ever looks like evil with all these big red alerts that say, I'm going to oppress a bunch of people. I'm trying to get you to not notice so that I can crush others and retain power. They need us, empire needs us, these big systems and institutions and forces need us to say, yeah, that seems well measured. We're just being smart here. We're just being safe. We don't want our way of life to be hindered in any way by these new arrivals, these non-citizens that I'm just not sure about. What if they're taking advantage of my tax dollars? Which, by the way, Egypt developed a fantastically efficient socialist system based on their taxes later on. That's an entirely another story. Ask me about it later. It's one of the reasons Cleopatra was so looked down upon by the Romans. But anyway, back onto track. Socialism, taxes, oh, right. All right, so we're talking about the ways that we set the stage for oppression to happen. Looks reasonable. Colossians 2 says, deception hides itself in reasonable arguments. So we need to really make sure we're cultivating the opposite of those earlier things, a worldview of abundance, relationships, discernment, honoring other people, making sure that we believe that there's enough so that we are not seduced into these kinds of practices, these kind of behaviors that Egypt puts on display for us. So let's see exactly what Pharaoh's strategy is. In verse 11, it says, so the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as supply cities for Pharaoh in Hebrew, Pharaoh in English. Quick pause. We know that this is at least a partially historical story because Pithom and Ramesses are real cities that were built just a little bit outside of where the Israelites were living, a little bit to the east. And it was Ramesses II who ordered those cities to be built. And so Prince of Egypt got it right. Go back, rewatch it. Still so good. Okay, so they forced them to build these cities, verse 12, but the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly, and they made their lives bitter, with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the first whose name was Shifra and the second whose name was Pu'ah, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she may live. And so this is how things escalate, right? It doesn't just stay at one level of evil. We're never satisfied once we start taking power, once we start allowing ourselves to crush another group. It's never enough for it just to be a little, keep them at the fringes. We will continually convince ourselves that harsher and harsher action is necessary. And so the Midrash, which is an ancient 2.5 thousand year old Jewish commentary or series of stories about the text, says that that first task, building Pithom and Ramesses, the cities, they were paid for that labor. And Pharaoh even came out and helped out with the task force, right? So it's not that long of a commute. It's nearby your neighborhood where you already live. We'll pay you. It's fine. And it doesn't work. And the sons of Israel keep multiplying, and there's more and more and more of them. Obviously the wise thing truly for Pharaoh to have done, if he was really worried about this domestic threat, then he would have made sure that the Hebrew people enjoyed living in their country enough that they would not want to rebel against Egypt if an incoming force arrived, right? If you build a system of mutual aid, of benefiting one another, you don't have to worry about such things. But if you have a worldview of scarcity, you don't have room to try to form relationships, to try to build bridges. You are tight right here, which is what Egypt means in Hebrew. It's Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim means place of tightness. There's not enough room. Okay, so instead of that, he tries to oppress them via labor. And again, the Midrash tells us some rather raunchy stories of why that failed. Don't need to go into it here. Not too raunchy. It's not WAP. It's 2,500 years old, but of all sorts of tricks that the Hebrew people came up with in order to keep meeting up with their significant others during this time, which is rather fun, but it didn't work, right? It's hard to crush an entire people group and not have a blowback. Thankfully, that's the case, but empirical systems seem to have trouble learning that. May we not even try to begin with. Okay, so they started off giving them wages. Pharaoh's there. It doesn't work. They expand their labor. They make it more difficult. They have all kinds of field work, it says, that they're applied to, and that doesn't work. So Pharaoh calls forth genocide as his next strategy. Hopefully, if the Egyptian citizens if he had started there, if he just called them together and said, hey, your neighbors over there, let's go kill all their babies or half their babies, they would have not gone along with it. But this is the way that it works. And this is why we have to stay vigilant and lie with activists and listen to survivors and keep doing that work early on, because if we allow ourselves to be complacent and say, oh, that's just the way it is. Oh, I know there's kids in cages, but they're probably trafficked here anyway. If we allow all of those narratives from the prevailing power to sink in and we start closing our eyes, we will end up at the levels of violence that the Egyptians found themselves entrenched in. So let's see what happened. What happened when Pharaoh gives this order to God's people, or to these women. Let's be more specific. So he says, if it's a daughter, she may live. If it's a son, kill him. Verse 17. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned midwives and asked them, why have you done this and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very numerous. And since the midwives feared God, he gave them households. Just fascinating about what that means. We can talk about that at a later time. But how absolutely amazing, courageous, baller, throw in whatever words you like there. These two women stop and save an entire half a generation of boys from genocide. It's so beautiful. So let's look at it a little bit. In verse 15, it says that the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. Now in the Hebrew, it says, it just says the midwives of the Hebrews. It doesn't say Hebrew midwives, so we're not sure whether they're Egyptian midwives to the Hebrews, or if they're Hebrew midwives to the Hebrews. However, when we look at the midwives' names, Shifra, which means when it's scratched, it gleams. So it's a gemstone terminology. Polishing leads to gleaming. And Pu'ah seems to not be of Hebrew origin, but seems to have to do with glittering. So you have these two gems of women coming together, potentially cross-culturally, aligned together, right? They take that relationship that broke down with Joseph's death, and they come together, and they are able to not just make a difference, but save this whole community, right? And here's why this is so good, other than just women kicking you know what in the Bible, is that first off, they use the narrative of empire against the empire. We use empire here as shorthand for like the evil empire, for the systems and institutions of injustice, which rather than building beauty and peace and flourishing for all humanity, they try to achieve their ends through crushing other people. So if you ever hear me say the ways of empire, that's what I mean. Okay, so they face empire, and they get away with it by using the same narratives. So when when Pharaoh says to them, why are you letting them live? He's figured it out somehow. Surely if he doesn't mind killing 300,000 children, it's probably a little bit large, but doesn't mind killing enormous swaths of the population. He wouldn't mind killing these two, but they say that there's a reason they can't do their jobs. They lie. And my translation says, for the Hebrew women are vigorous. That's a very funny Mask of Zorro-esque fun translation, but it literally does not say vigorous. It says ki chayot, which means like animals. So earlier, Pharaoh was telling all of the people, these Hebrew people are not human, they're subhuman, they're less than us, they're different from us. And so the midwives come back and say, yeah, that's why we're having such problems, because they're not like us, they're just so animalistic. We can't possibly do our jobs. And he, believing his own narrative, says, oh, okay, that makes sense. And they're allowed to live and thus continue doing their job, continue lying, continue subverting the system. The second reason that I love this so much is that Pharaoh, in saying, I only need the male children to be killed, or the male appearing children to be killed, he is saying, I'm not worried about the women. They're not really a threat. You can let them live. They're fine. Why would I be concerned about the women? And who is it that subverts him and causes his scheme and his strategy not to work? But the women. And so the glorious thing for us there is that the message that empire wants us to hear is always, your vote doesn't matter. You know, we've got the electoral college in place. What will voting even do, right? Just stay home. Your vote doesn't matter. Or, you know, you could really make a big difference if you were a congressperson. You could make a big difference if you were the head of a nonprofit, you had a big business. Those things are true. Those people are blessed with influence. However, these women likely did not perceive themselves as a member of an elite social class who yielded a lot of power, who wielded a lot of power, right? They're the healthcare workers who at that time were not, you know, enormously high in prestige in their particular society. And yet they do not discount themselves in their ability to do something right, to do something just, to do something meaningful. Many of us have received lots of messages over time, whether because of our sexual orientation or our gender identity, or our socioeconomic status or our ability level. All of those things are different strategies that the systems of power like to really enforce and communicate to you that you are not able to really take part in what's going on. Your voice doesn't really matter. You should just get a job, keep your head down, play into the system, and these other people will take care of things for you. This story says, no, we are given these opportunities to stand up, to make a difference, to subvert the system, and maybe no one will ever know in the system that you did that. But I bet you that all of those women who were giving birth never forgot Chiffra and Bois for the rest of their lives. Their sons heard those stories and cherished them. And light was brought, kingdom, we like to say, is brought. More life is in the world because these two women made this choice. So may we also have the same chutzpah, may we have the same courage, tenacity, foresight, and fearlessness to do the same things, because that's the other message. If you stand up, if you go protest, for instance, about an injustice that was done in your community, just shook the camera there, not an earthquake, something terrible will happen. You'll be thrown in an unmarked van and dragged off, and you know what? The risk isn't worth it. These women had to go before the king and lie to his face about what was happening, and they still chose to do it. They're so rooted in power, rooted in an understanding of the opportunity that they had and their own personhood and worthiness to be there and to be part of something greater than themselves, that they chose to do that. So may we be the same. May we recognize our privilege, recognize our opportunities, recognize the places that we've been put in where we can leverage more justice to happen. In order for us to do that, in order for our eyes to be open to be able to take those opportunities, we need to have the worldview of there is enough room for all of us. We need to have the worldview that speaking about others in a way that dehumanizes them leads to inhumane acts. We need to have the worldview that there is space to make a relationship with people on the other side. So let's start there so that when our opportunity comes, like Chiffra and Bois, we're ready. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for these stories. I ask that they would buoy us up in vision of who we are and how you might use us and what opportunities might come before us. I pray that you'd make us ready for that. I pray that we would understand that with you and with each other and our community, we do have enough. This world, this system, this economic system likes to tell us that we need more, and that there's not enough, but that is truly not the case, Lord. I ask that we could find that life, find that enoughness within you, within ourselves, within our communities, that we might be primed to make a difference. I ask all these things in your name, Jesus, amen. So, thank you for joining us. If you're listening to this, either tomorrow or today at 7:30 p.m., We are starting discussion based on these different topics that came up in the sermon, but you can come a little early, 7:15. I know Zoom isn't everybody's cup of tea 9 months into a pandemic, or however far along we are. Further than 9 months, 10 months. Anyway, you're welcome to come hang out at 7:15. I'd love to meet you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you then.